Hi, I'm Nafisa Latic, and this is Across the Balkans. Today on the show, the impact of the Ukraine crisis on the Balkans and Southeastern Europe. In a move that has angered the international community, Russia ordered troops into the separatist regions of Luhansk and Donetsk in Ukraine, recognized by Vladimir Putin as being independent. The overall unease and concerns over security generated by the rise of other separatist movements in the region is also being felt in Eastern Europe. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says Putin's actions violate existing international agreements. During the NATO defense ministers' meeting in Brussels last week, Stoltenberg raised the possibility of sending battle groups into Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. He says NATO allies have the right to protect each other from Russia. But what will having new NATO battlegrounds across the region mean for the Southeastern Europe? Abdul Wahab Ayupi explains.
With each passing hour, as Russia formally recognizes Ukraine's pro-Russian breakaway regions in the eastern province of Donbas and orders to send peacekeeping troops there, tension is rising even more across Eastern Europe and the Balkans. NATO allies have forced on standby and are promising that an invasion will have devastating consequences.
Reiterăm susținerea pentru integritatea teritorială și suveranitatea Ucrainei și a celorlalți parteneri estici, precum și pentru consolidarea rezilienței acestora. Trebuie însă să fim pregătiți și pentru scenariul în care
In addition to 3,000 extra soldiers sent to Poland and Romania by the United States, the German Air Force has transferred 3 Eurofighter jets to shield Eastern Europe from any potential spillover from the Ukraine crisis.
Ministers decided to develop options for further strengthen NATO's deterrence and defense, including to consider establishing new NATO battle groups in Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And I welcomed the offer by France to lead such a battle group in Romania.
Bulgaria, also a NATO member, has agreed to assemble battle group in case of an escalation in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. In mid-February, Spain sent 4 fighter jets to police the country's airspace, while the Netherlands is expected to deploy 2 F-35 jets to Bulgaria in the coming months.
България е и ще бъде отговорен съюзник с предвидима позиция и никой не би трябвало да се упражнява по тази тема.
But several Western Balkan nations remain divided about the conflict in Ukraine. While Albania, Kosovo and North Macedonia openly support Ukraine and its Western allies, other countries in the region still haven't taken a side. Serbia is considered the country in the region most vulnerable to Russian influence. Despite that, it hasn't yet committed to maintaining the balance between friendly and threatened Slavic countries. However, most of Serbian media and foreign policy commentators are on Russia's side. The situation on the Ukrainian borders was another reason for the ongoing disagreement between Croatian President Zoran Milanovic and Prime Minister Andrej Plenković. Milanovic stated NATO strengthening of its presence in corrupt Ukraine has nothing to do with Croatia, while Plenković apologized to Kiev and said that Croatia respects the territorial integrity of Ukraine. One of the US Navy's largest aircraft carriers, the Harry Truman, landed off the coast of Croatia near the city of Split last week. On that occasion, Croatian Prime Minister Andrej Plenković called the ship's arrival in the Adriatic a symbol of unity within NATO.
The aircraft carrier's presence today is also a symbol of our time. A time at which we need to speak with one strong transatlantic voice and state clearly that we stand united to defend freedom and democracy of our nations, as well as to preserve peace and stability in Europe and the transatlantic area.
Russia has deployed more than 100,000 troops and heavy military equipment near its border with Ukraine. However, the Kremlin continues to deny its intention to invade. Abdul Wahab Ayubi, TRT World.
To further discuss the impact the crisis in Ukraine is having on the Balkans and neighboring NATO members, I'm joined from Zagreb by Božo Kovačević. He is a former Croatian ambassador to Russia. And in Bucharest is Sorin Ionita. He is the president of Expert Forum, a think tank working on public policy. Thank you both for joining us here on Across the Balkans. I really appreciate your time. Sorin, let me start with you. How significant is the role of NATO countries of Southeastern Europe during the Ukraine crisis?
Well, I'm not sure how significant are we for the crisis, the small countries of Southeastern Europe, but NATO is very significant for us. And this is one more proof why all these efforts in the last 10, 15 years were made actually in the first line countries, like we call them, countries like Romania and Poland. We can see today that NATO membership is very important. And maybe we can make a contribution. Of course, in the case of Romania, the main contribution is it's a territory and a solid participation in the alliance, because we see now that the level of military commitment is increasing at the Black Sea from NATO, and it's good, to have a nation and a territory with very solid pro-Western, values.
Right. Of all the countries in the region, reports show that Romania is the one where NATO enjoys the highest level of trust among the people. And as you were saying, more troops are expected to be deployed there. Why is this the case? And are the new troops welcomed in Romania?
It's a long historical, debate. We don't have the time now to make it, but it's not something very recent. That is clear. Romania, the young Romanian nation in the 19th century had a very, ambiguous relationship with the Tsarist Empire. There were occupation of territories. There were, like we call them, betrayals. Now historians have to decide on that. But the fact is that sort of Russo-skepticism has always prevailed in the Romanian society. And, the Soviet period didn't make it easier at all. And especially the last 20 years of communism. So even in the communist time, the 70s and the 80s, the ideology of the communist regime, Ceausescu, was quite anti-Soviet. So we never learned Russian, for example, in schools. It was even a little bit anti-Russian. Anti-Soviet, of course, it was a masquerade because they were, client regime of Moscow. But in a way, culturally, they wanted to make this separation. So today, you can put safely Romania in this box together with Poland, like a nation with, deep historical skepticism towards anything that comes from Moscow, for good or for bad, I have to say. So it's very, very a reaction from the first moment.
Right. Let me bring in Božo now. What having new NATO battlegrounds across the region mean for the Eastern Europe at this point?
Well, for the Eastern Europe, as far as I understand, certain Eastern European countries feel that they have to be protected, and they understand that only NATO can give them security guarantees. It's obvious that if war conflict starts in Eastern Europe, that main victims will be East European countries. Regarding Balkan countries who are not integrated yet into European Union, and some of them are not integrated into NATO, present situation can have serious impact on their internal political situation, and that rise of tensions in Ukraine can have serious security consequences as security instability in the region. We know that way Russia is trying to to implement certain countries is to insist on frozen conflicts. That's the situation in Georgia, that's the situation currently in Ukraine, although that conflict is not frozen, it's hot one. It's a situation in Moldova too. So potential frozen conflict in Balkan region could be Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We know that Russia is supporting current authorities of Republika Srpska, and we know that those authorities are opting for separation from
Right, Božo,
Bosnia.
let me just jump in here. Croatian President Milanovic also showed the support for the Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik that is directly supported by Russia recently. What is this telling us? He also made some comments about the NATO expansion, saying this is against Croatia's interest. Why is Mr. Milanovic taking this position?
Well, I think that the first of his goals is to get political support inside Croatia, internal political support. The second aspect is tactics. We know that currently there are negotiations concerning new election law in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in that respect, ethnic Croats in Bosnia and the Bosniaks or Muslim population in Bosnia are on the opposite sides, and in that respect, Bosnian Croats and Croatian President Milanovic are trying to make temporary coalition with Republika Srpska leadership. In my opinion, it's a deep mistake, and that's not the right way to get goals. If goals are internal stability of Bosnia and Herzegovina and its territorial integrity. Regarding participation of Croatian military in possible NATO operations in East Europe, well, it's President's personal opinion. He can decide not to send our soldiers in that region, but if this happens, then Parliament can bring decision with the 2/3 majority. So, but what is the way of reasoning of our president? He perceives that the current conflict in Ukraine, in fact, is not a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's conflict between Russia and United States and Russia and global West.
Right, Sorin, what is Russia offering to these nationalist elites in Southeastern Europe that the US is not offering? Why are we seeing more and more leaders standing by Russia during this crisis?
They offer them, attention. Some resources here and there, where the legislation in countries is not totally opposed to financing parties from abroad, and there are such countries in the European Union. But they also offer them the possibility to get into the big politics, especially in countries where the establishment is pretty much pro-Western and pro-EU and pro-Brussels. So new opportunities, and this example that you were discussing a moment ago about Bosnia and the situation in Croatia with the president, it shows you how skillful Russians are, to cultivate local elites, to exploit, domestic politics in order to foment actually this distrust in institutions, to undermine the European project. So this is a thing they are best at. And it shows that you don't have to have a direct border with Russia. Bosnia doesn't.
Right.
But still they are very active there. Still they can undermine democracy and institutions. And this is what they are typically doing, like in Ukraine, like in the Republic of Moldova. I don't think we will see tanks, Russian tanks, entering Poland or Romania or Slovakia. But what they can do is to create such gray zones, so to create problems and never solve them. Like this, Donbass, like Transnistria for Moldova. And with these instruments, with these uncertain territories as instruments, they take the domestic politic hostage.
So are you saying Moldova
nation.
is
And
the
this is the objective?
Right. Sorin, just briefly, so are you saying Moldova is at the moment the most vulnerable when it comes to the next Russian aggression, possibly?
Most probably more than the Baltic states, because they are not members of NATO, so they are not covered by any security arrangement, and they already have actually Russian troops there immediately 40 kilometers away from the capital in a frozen conflict which has been there for more than 3 decades. So yes, it is a possibility, and you know how Mr. Putin does. He doesn't have a very clear plan for 3 years ahead. He's just opening his menu of possibilities. He's pushing here, pushing there, and he goes for the jugular whenever he feels that the adversary is soft. So he has many options on the table, and he can push anywhere. Now he's taking a step back a little bit because probably he didn't anticipate how unitary the West and especially NATO was. But you can be sure he will start from a different point.
Right. Bojo, how dependent are the countries in Southeastern Europe on a gas coming from Russia? And what kind of impact and the consequences would be of the possible sanctions on Russia in Croatia?
Well, some of those countries are dependent and some are not. I think that the most dependent is Republic of Serbia. And there is Hungary too, but Hungary is relatively friendly relationships with Russia, and that dependency does not threaten them, does not threaten Hungarian government. Regarding Croatia and the territories of former Yugoslavia, there are alternative directions. For instance, there is LNG terminal in Croatia, and through that point it's possible to organize supplies of gas to the region. Earlier, in the past, Croatia was much more dependent of Russian gas, but currently it's not. There are alternative possibilities, alternative supply directions for the region, and I think that it will not be the crucial problem regarding those tensions between Russia and the West. The most important problem will be political consequences of those tensions.
Right. Sorin, can Russia divide NATO in the event of conflict? What if these smaller states pull out?
They definitely tried. I don't think that the big problem is for the small states to pull out, especially in Eastern Europe, because at least the states in the first line, you won't see that in the Baltic states or in Poland or in Romania, or even in countries like Hungary, which it was rightly said they are quite friendly with Moscow today. There is no discussion about pulling out of NATO. It was a bit of rumor, Viktor Orban put on the table the membership to EU, but not so much of NATO. The problem of the big countries, and we have been always concerned about the commitment of the Western powers, to come to the aid of this region. And there were good reasons for such, to fear that, especially under the administration of the previous president, Donald Trump. The commitment to NATO was a bit shaky. And of course, it might be the case again with the new president in Washington. And then you have the situation with the big EU members like Germany. So the situation in energy security, for example, is much more serious in Germany than in the Balkans. Because in the Balkans, we've been slow and rather incompetent, but alternatives exist, including through Turkey, including to have access to gas from Azerbaijan. including LNG. We should have more, sea ports and sea terminals to get LNG. And this is perfectly possible for Germany as well. So I think we will have more and more of this discussion. And people, the problem, the commitment to NATO, as long as it is firm from the big EU member countries, I think we are fine. You won't see small nations going out of NATO anytime soon.
Right. Sorin, in case the conflict escalates, is Romania ready for the influx of possible war refugees heading there?
This is what we were discussing today. Even today, this is the main news on TV. Is they are starting to prepare, camps in order to host refugees. But I frankly don't think this is realistic, because if there are refugees, I mean, we are a bit cynical now. But if there are civilian refugees, they will not stop in Romania. They will probably go to Western Europe somehow. And whoever wanted to flee, they already fled Ukraine because they don't need visas anymore. So whoever was so scared. And after all, I mean, Ukraine is a big country, and there's no discussion about Russia occupying the west of the country. So there's enough space, to host refugees. That's not the big problem. The big problem, is how to resist. And especially how to resist this asymmetric war. Because again, I don't think we will face a big, open conflict with clear lines of battle. What is very threatening, but including for countries like Romania, or like Poland, or like the Baltic states, is how they undermine the credibility of the governments, how they pay internal actors in order, to create chaos, and how they start a conflict, and they say, below the level of open conflict in order to create an decision uncertainty in NATO, so that you never know, and eventually to split NATO when some countries will say this is, aggression enough, we need to intervene, Article 5, while some members will say no, this level of conflict is not enough, let's stay back and wait. This is what they aim for. So this is a goal.
Bojo, are we heading to even more challenging times? And what does this mean for the NATO allies in Eastern Europe in general?
It's a kind of test for them. And I think that if real intention of Russia was to split NATO countries by strengthening those tensions, they got just the opposite. We are witnessing unity inside of NATO and much higher level of readiness of European countries to participate in sanctions against Russia and to participate in NATO forces which are dislocated in Eastern Europe. So, in my opinion, Russia got just the opposite result than it expected. And I would like to add something. I agree with the colleague about intentions, about tactics and strategies of Russian Federation. But in the same time, I think that we have to bear in mind that Russia has a perception of threat from NATO, from expansion of NATO to the east. And it would be reasonable to discuss in the same time extremely negative perception of Russia in East European countries and extremely negative perception of NATO in Russia. And fortunately, it seems that President Biden and NATO are ready to discuss those issues with Russia. Russian behavior is not determined just by their aggressive intentions, but it's determined also by their perception of threat, which is coming from expansion of NATO.
Okay, and we have time just for you, Sorin, if you have something to add. What can we expect in the next couple of weeks?
As somebody said, it's not so much that NATO expanded as NATO stayed where they are. They had the headquarters in Brussels. It's some European countries wanted very much to join NATO, and they made all the reforms and the efforts possible. And then probably somebody somewhere in Moscow should ask themselves, why all these guys all want to join NATO? I mean, what's wrong here? If you have a problem of perception, probably you should see a psychotherapist, so to correct your perception. if the perception is not
Yeah,
real.
but,
Otherwise, if
it's
there are,
relevant all sides,
confidence
all sides.
mechanism, confidence.
Right.
Yes, if you there are enough confidence building mechanisms in these negotiations about disarmament that you can put in place, and they are perfectly acceptable, like reciprocal inspections, maximum levels of weapons that you can deploy, soldiers, everything, all this should be on the table, including rockets or everything which is in the region. But the perception of threat and then invading a neighboring country without reason, that is not acceptable. It requires some medication.
Okay, Božo, if you want to jump in here with a final thought.
There is no reason, for people for the person who is afraid of something. There is reason, and that perception of threat is the fact which has to be discussed, not only by psychologists but by politicians too.
Okay, I really appreciate your insights, Božo Kovačević and Sorin Jonita. Thank you both for joining us on the program. Across the Balkans, we'll continue to follow the crisis at the Ukrainian border and its impact in the region. Thanks for watching this episode, but we want to leave you with a video that we all loved here in the team that is taking a traditional dance to all new heights. After performing in the Sarajevo Tango Festival, Turkish instructor Zeynep Aktar and her partner took their moves to Mostar Old Bridge, stepping lightly despite the rain. Take a look at this, and thanks for watching. See you next week. Bye-bye.